It was early morning, and Jack Davis, 34, was just stepping outside, his coffee steaming in his hand, ready for another peaceful day. That's when he heard it, screaming. Not just any screaming, but the unmistakable shriek of Karen Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of their neighborhood. His stomach sank as he turned towards her. Karen, with her face redder than a fire hydrant, stood at the edge of his property, hands on her hips, shouting as though the world had wronged her. "What's going on?" Jack thought, puzzled. He walked toward her, his brow furrowing with every step. What could Karen possibly want this time? As he approached, he saw her brand-new, glossy luxury SUV completely trapped, positioned awkwardly in the middle of a massive trench. The trench Jack had legally dug, just around his driveway, a defensive measure, against the very person causing all this drama. The trench was now part of his property, and the sight of her SUV stuck in it brought a twisted sense of satisfaction. Karen's face twisted in horror as she realized the predicament she was in. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, looking at Jack, her voice escalating in fury. "Oh, just some security modifications," Jack replied calmly, suppressing a grin. "It's all legal. According to the zoning laws, I'm allowed to make changes to my property like this." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't just dig a hole around my car," she shouted, now visibly shaking with rage. "Actually, I can," Jack said, pointing to the printed zoning laws in his hand. "Everything's fine. I even filed for a permit, Karen, city approved." Her teeth clenched. "You're going to regret this," she spat. Jack only shrugged. "Guess we'll see." He turned and walked back inside, leaving Karen standing there fuming, a defeated figure at the edge of his property. The tension hung thick in the air, but Jack knew this was just the beginning. The war wasn't over yet. The tension between Jack Davis and Karen Whitmore had only just begun to escalate, and it was already clear this would not be an ordinary battle. The next morning, Jack was up early, his coffee in hand as he watched the sun rise over the neighborhood. Just as he was savoring the quiet, a familiar screech cut through the calm. There she was again, Karen, standing at the edge of his property, her arms crossed, her face as red as a tomato. Jack's stomach churned as he walked toward her, already dreading what she might say next. "Morning, Karen," he greeted her, keeping his tone level, though his patience was wearing thin. "I know what you're doing," Karen snapped, her voice sharp and angry. "You think you can just dig holes and build barriers around your property without consequences? You can't get away with this." Jack's eyes narrowed, but he remained composed. "I'm just protecting my property. It's legal, Karen. You can't stop me," he replied calmly, though his heart was pounding. He knew this wasn't over. She glared at him, the muscles in her face tightening. "The HOA will not stand for this. They're going to take action. You'll see," she threatened, her voice laced with venom. "Oh, really?" Jack raised an eyebrow, not backing down. "Because I'm pretty sure I've checked all the regulations. I've got a permit for everything, Karen. Everything is by the book." Karen's face twisted in fury. "You're going to regret this. Mark my words." She turned and stormed off, muttering under her breath as she marched back to her house. Jack stood there for a moment, watching her go. He wasn't intimidated. If anything, the fire in her words only fueled his resolve. The tension in the air was thick, and though Karen had walked away, the battle was far from over. Jack Davis had spent the last few days researching his rights, flipping through property codes and zoning laws late into the night. His coffee had long since gone cold, but the fire inside him only burned hotter. He couldn't believe it had come to this. Karen Whitmore, 48, had crossed the line one too many times. Now it was time for his retaliation. With a quiet sense of satisfaction, Jack watched as the construction crew arrived the next morning. He had already rented the excavator, and with a few firm words, the workers got to work. He had planned this meticulously. No one would see it coming. The idea had started as a joke, but now it was a statement. A 4-foot trench was carved around his driveway, wide enough to keep any vehicle from crossing it. But that was just the beginning. As the workers continued their task, Jack stood nearby, observing. He wasn't worried about Karen's threats anymore. He had the law on his side, and now he had a backup plan. Karen would never expect what was coming next. By evening, the trench was complete. But Jack wasn't done yet. He told the crew to install a medieval-style drawbridge. It was a simple pulley system, nothing fancy, but it would work. It was a perfect response to Karen's relentless harassment, and he couldn't help but smile as he imagined her reaction. It would be too good to miss. The next morning, Karen stormed over, her face twisted in anger. She stood at the edge of the trench, her SUV parked just beyond the edge, caught in a trap of her own making. "What is this?" she shrieked. "This is illegal. You can't do this." Jack walked over calmly, enjoying every second of her outrage. "It's just a security modification," he replied coolly, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the moment. "Totally legal, Karen. I even got a permit." Karen's face went white. She couldn't argue with that. The days following Karen's tantrum were filled with an unsettling tension. Jack Davis had expected her to retaliate, but he wasn't prepared for the full force of her wrath. It wasn't long before Karen Whitmore, 48, showed up at his door, her eyes blazing with fury. The air between them crackled with hostility as she stormed up his driveway. "You think you've won, don't you?" Karen hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You've dug yourself a hole, Jack, and you're going to pay for it." Jack took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the moment. "I don't know, Karen. It seems like I've followed every rule. City approved, remember?" His words were calm, even though his blood was boiling with anticipation. Karen's fists clenched at her sides. "You're playing with fire," she snarled. "The HOA won't stand for this. You'll be buried under fines, and I'll make sure of it." "Oh, I'm sure you will," Jack replied smoothly. "But I'm not the one digging a hole. You're the one who's been making this personal. And now the law's on my side." Karen's lips curled into a sneer. "You'll regret this," she spat, before turning on her heel and stomping off. Jack stood there for a moment, watching her retreat, his heart pounding in his chest. She didn't know it yet, but this wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. He'd already been preparing for this. Jack wasn't a man to be intimidated. The trench had been a statement, a legal move, and now the next step of his plan was already set in motion. He was going to take things further, right under Karen's nose, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. Jack Davis felt the growing pressure as Karen Whitmore ramped up her harassment. The HOA had ignored his legal rights, and Karen's threats were escalating with each passing day. He knew he had to put an end to this before things went too far. As he sat at his desk, scrolling through zoning laws and property codes, a plan began to form. His frustration turned into focused determination. This would be his moment to take back control. A few days later, armed with a permit and the full legal backing he needed, Jack set his plan into motion. He rented a massive excavator, hired a crew, and instructed them to begin digging. The trench that surrounded his driveway would be wide, deep, and impenetrable, a clear message that he was no longer playing by Karen's rules. But Jack wasn't just building a barrier. He was sending a declaration of independence. The next morning, as Jack sipped his coffee and observed the crew working, he noticed Karen storming toward him, her face twisted in fury. He'd known she wouldn't take this lying down, but the venom in her eyes made his pulse quicken. "Jack!" she shouted. "You can't just go around digging holes in the ground. The HOA will make you pay for this. You'll regret it." Jack stood up slowly, walking toward her with a quiet confidence. "I'm sorry, Karen, but I'm well within my rights. This is my property, and I'm protecting it," he replied evenly. Karen's jaw tightened as she clenched her fists. "You'll be hearing from the HOA. You think you've won? But this is just the beginning." Jack didn't flinch. "The only thing beginning here, Karen, is the end of your reign." Her eyes widened as she realized there was no turning back. Jack had outmaneuvered her, and the tables had officially turned. For the first time, the fight felt like it was on his terms. The following days after Jack's defensive move only heightened the tension. Karen Whitmore refused to back down. Her threats had become more personal, more intense, and Jack Davis knew the time had come for the final confrontation. Every time Karen showed up at his doorstep, her eyes filled with venomous determination. Jack felt the weight of her stubbornness pushing him toward a breaking point, but he wasn't about to let her win. One afternoon, a knock at the door broke the silence. Jack opened it cautiously, and there she stood, Karen, fuming, her face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. "I'm done with your games, Jack," Karen spat, her hands shaking with fury. "You think this ridiculous trench is going to stop me? Think again. I've called in the big guns." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "The HOA can't stop me," he said coolly, his calm demeanor betraying none of the anxiety that surged beneath the surface. Her eyes narrowed as she leaned in. "Oh, I think they can. The inspectors are coming. You'll be lucky if you're not buried under fines by the end of the day." Jack swallowed hard, but his resolve didn't waver. "Do your worst. I'm ready." Karen's lips curled into a smug grin. "We'll see about that," she muttered, turning on her heel to leave, but not before delivering a final venomous glare. Jack watched her storm off, his thoughts racing. He had known Karen wouldn't give up easily, but something about her last words felt different. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It felt like war. The next move was his, and he had a plan that would force her hand. He wasn't going to let her push him around anymore. As the day wore on, Jack continued preparing. He knew that his plan, though audacious, would be the key to ending this once and for all. The day had finally come. Jack Davis stood at the window, watching as the two figures in dark suits approached his driveway. His heart pounded, but he remained calm, his hand wrapped tightly around his coffee mug. These men weren't just any ordinary visitors. They were the fake officers Karen Whitmore had sent to intimidate him. She had been desperate to reclaim control after Jack's bold move. But he was ready for this. As the men stepped onto his property, Jack took a deep breath and stepped outside to greet them. Their faces were stern, but there was something off about them. One of them flashed a badge, though it looked a little too polished, a little too new. "You need to move that bridge." "Mr. Davis," the first man said, his voice gravelly. "We've been instructed to remove the obstruction." Jack stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "I'm sorry, but I don't think you have the authority to do that," he said, his voice steady. His pulse quickened, but he refused to show any signs of fear. These men weren't real officers, and he had already made arrangements for this moment. The second man took a step forward, trying to block Jack's view of the drawbridge. "You're in violation of HOA rules. You'll need to comply," he growled. "That's where you're wrong," Jack replied, his eyes narrowing. "I'm within my rights. You're not real officers, and if you keep pushing, I'll call the real authorities." The two men froze. Jack reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his U.S. Marshal badge. The men's faces drained of color as they realized the truth. "You're under arrest for impersonating law enforcement," Jack said calmly, his voice steady. The fake officers stammered, unable to hide their panic. The authorities arrived minutes later, dragging the men away in cuffs. Jack couldn't help but smile as the situation turned in his favor. The battle was nearing its end, and Karen was about to lose everything. Jack Davis sat at his desk, watching the final pieces of his plan fall into place. He'd been careful, meticulous. Karen Whitmore had no idea what was coming next. After weeks of her harassing, manipulating, and threatening, Jack had finally set the trap, one that would force Karen to face the consequences of her actions. The day of the arbitration meeting had arrived, and Jack was ready. As he walked into the room, the oppressive atmosphere was thick with tension. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression smug, her lips curled into a thin, arrogant smile. Her confidence was palpable, but Jack could see it in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that she tried desperately to hide. "Welcome, Mr. Davis," Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I trust you understand the gravity of this meeting. We've come to a final decision on your modifications." Jack's eyes locked onto hers, his face stoic, but inside, his pulse raced. "I'm ready," he said calmly. She smirked, continuing her spiel about the HOA's rules and regulations. Jack listened patiently, but the entire time, he was quietly executing the next step of his plan. As Karen spoke, Jack's fingers hovered over his phone, waiting for the signal. Then the moment came. With a sudden swipe, he activated the live stream, his phone recording every word, every action, and every threat. The board members, sitting around the table, glanced nervously as they realized what Jack had done. The live stream captured Karen's lies, her manipulation, and the illegal actions she'd been taking with HOA funds. The evidence was irrefutable. Karen's face drained of color when she realized she'd been exposed. The room fell silent, except for the hum of Jack's phone as the feed continued to broadcast. "Gotcha," Jack muttered under his breath, his heart pounding with exhilaration. The morning after Karen was unceremoniously ousted from her position in the HOA, the air in the neighborhood felt different. Lighter, freer. Jack Davis stood at the edge of his driveway, watching as Karen's belongings were being loaded into a moving truck. Her SUV sat in the driveway, now empty and devoid of any last-minute defiance. The once arrogant queen of the neighborhood was being driven out, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of justice welling up inside him. He had won. The HOA was dissolved. Karen had been publicly humiliated, and her fraudulent schemes were exposed for all to see. As the moving truck pulled away, Jack caught a glimpse of her walking past the drawbridge. He had built, still in place, a symbol of his victory. Karen's face was pale, and her eyes darted to the structure with a mix of defeat and disbelief. She had underestimated him, and now the consequences of her actions had come crashing down around her. Jack took a deep breath, the weight of the last few weeks lifting off his shoulders. He had fought for what was right, and it felt damn good. There was no turning back now. The neighborhood was free from her control, and it was time to rebuild. People began to gather, some offering congratulations, others simply nodding in quiet appreciation for the change Jack had brought about. It was clear that the power dynamic in the neighborhood had shifted forever. As he walked back to his house, Jack paused, glancing at the empty spot where Karen's house had once stood as a symbol of fear. Now, it was a reminder of what could be achieved when one person stood up for justice. He smiled to himself, knowing that no matter what came next, he had outlasted the storm. The drawbridge, once a symbol of conflict, now stood as a monument to resilience. Jack Davis and Hoa Karen were locked in a fierce battle for control in their neighborhood. Hoa Karen, the self-proclaimed queen, used her power to intimidate others, but Jack fought back with intelligence and strategy. He built a trench and drawbridge to protect his property, outsmarting Hoa Karen at every turn. Despite her threats, Hoa Karen couldn't stop Jack. His legal knowledge and persistence exposed her manipulations, leading to her downfall. In the end, Hoa Karen's power was shattered, and Jack became the hero of the community. The story of Jack and Hoa Karen shows that standing up to tyranny and injustice can bring about real change,